Colleagues, we have come to the last of our sessions. I just wanting to look at the energy in the room. Can I see the hands of those people who are doctors and professors here? Can I see doctors and professors? No doctors, no professors. Doctors, professors? In the room right here now. All the doctors, please, can you stand up? We want you to sing a song. No, don't be shy. Don't be shy of being a doctor and a professor. Please stand up. Please stand up. Let's give them a round of applause. These are the people that are creating knowledge for us. Now they're going to create a song for us. We're going to sing the one that, not the one from yesterday, the one that we did today. Okay, what does it say? Don't bend, but lean forward. Thank you, Prof. All right, let's join them, all of us, with master's degrees, diplomas, whatever. And let's all join them. We're going to sing this song. Lean forward, lean backwards to the, stand up, sit, to the. Professor, what's going on with you, sir? Let's do it again. Lean forward, lean backwards to the right, stand up, sit down, to the left, to the right. Yes, you can see that I was trying to be a present parent when my children were growing up, and I haven't forgotten these songs. All right. All right, now I'm going to call upon the following people. The moderator, Dr. Thokozani Chilenga Putau. I hope I didn't butcher that. She's a lecturer at the Department of Political Studies at the University of Witwatersrand. And they are going to be dealing with the topic of the African Union's external relations architecture and mechanisms, fit for purpose or due for rethinking. Who can remember that I was reading this thing today, but we've just, from that hour to now, did you even think that we're going to get so fast? All right, so we're doing it this morning. So, Doc, are you going to introduce them? Okay, but I'd like to welcome you. And are there others, or is just the two of you? Yes. Okay, this is a very important discussion about the AU, whether it's fit for purpose or what's going on with it. Let me hand over to you. Let's give them a round of applause, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the final session for the day. If you've made it this far to the graveyard shift, we are grateful. I'm Thokozani. I'm based in political studies here at Wits, and I'll be moderating this panel on the African Union's external relations architecture and mechanisms. For those of us who've been here since this morning, we've discussed African agency at some length, and I'm sure that we all still have comments and questions which might be addressed through this panel. Before we proceed, I would like to give some exciting news about the African Center for the Study of the US. Next year, they will be launching a Global Powers Research Group looking at the relationship between the US under their current president, Donald Trump, and the African continent, and how those relationships are playing out under that specific presidency, as well as how different power relationships across the globe are being changed by that presidency. So please look out for that in your emails, your inboxes, however you get news from ACSUS. Without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. We have three. Two of our speakers are going to present a paper that they've co-authored on this very topic. The first is Prof. Gilbert, who is an emeritus professor of international relations here at Wits. And over the last 35 years, he's taught in that department comparative politics African studies and as well as African studies in Kenya, Canada, and the US. His research focuses on African regional institutions, mediation, and conflict resolution, with a geographic focus on the Horn of Africa, Great Lakes region, and Southern Africa. Prof, I don't think that bio really does you justice, but thank you for being on this panel. Next, we have your co-author, Mr. Jagan Gray-Johnson, who is the advocacy advisor at the Open Society Foundations. He's worked there for almost 16 years, starting with the Africa Governance Monitoring and Advocacy Project, also known as AfriMap, as a communications and advocacy officer, where he contributed to research on the African standards in public service delivery and education, the justice sector, the rule of law, political participation, and democracy, as well as African peer review mechanism reports and the Public Broadcasting in Africa series. He was also instrumental in ushering in the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance with the Pan-African Parliament in 2012. He is a founding member of the Multi-Sectoral Working Group Against Corruption, which is a CSO group interfacing with the AU Advisory Board on Corruption, and he has also worked for UNICEF. So Jagan, I guess you are a millennial with many titles. Thank you for joining us. We know that you are booked and busy. And then finally, Sanusha Naidu, who will be responding to the paper. She is a foreign policy and political analyst. I'm sure some of us have seen her doing commentary in the news. She is currently a senior research associate based with the Institute for Global Dialogue. Her research interests include democratization in Africa, Africa's political economy and development, Africa's relations with emerging powers from the South, specifically BRICS and IBSA. She has a master's in international relations from the University of Staffordshire in the UK, and she's also worked at the Centre for Conflict Resolution based in Cape Town. Thank you for joining us, and I'm sure you'll keep the engagement lively. So let's start with the presentation. Prof, will you start or? Yeah. Okay. Is that all right? You have 10 minutes. If I stop you, I am the enforcer. Forgive me.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've been very generous coming back at this late hour. So I think I want to appreciate the attention that you put into this work. And moderator, thank you again for the introduction. We only met online, so I'm happy that at least I could meet you in person today. As the moderator has mentioned, this is actually a co-authored paper with Jagan, but also Bob is on that project. This is a research project that is focusing on African institutional actors and their relationship with the global actors. So that's really the core argument that we are going to develop here. What does this relationship look like? How has it evolved? Where is it going? And those are the things that we are going to capture in a paper that is essentially a work in progress. And what we'll need to do at the end, at some point, maybe next year, is to publish this paper, and then it can be circulated. I want to be very brief in my presentation because we don't have much time. 10 minutes is a very short time. But I just want to highlight the themes that are going to inform this paper that we are working on. And then Jagan will pick up on some of the themes that look at some of the current partnerships, G20, the AU, and the ongoing meeting in Luanda, EU-Africa, EU-AU partnership. This meeting is going on this weekend. And Sanusha, of course, she'll come in with her critique of the presentation. What I want to do first is to say, why is this topic important? It is important because the subtitle of our paper, which is, are these partnerships fit for purpose, or do they need rethinking? This was provoked by Paul Kagame's question to the African Union in 2016, where he said, is the African Union fit for purpose, or do we need to rethink the very architecture of the African Union and African continental institutions in general? Our focus is much more narrow, but we thought that subtitle would really speak to some of the questions that we're going to ask when we're looking at African partnerships with global actors. It is narrow because these partnerships have been with us at least since the 90s or even earlier. But we started from the premise that the constitutive act of the African Union, which was articulated in 2000, early 2000, set up the objective of first fostering partnerships with the rest of the world. The Constitutive Act talks about engaging and reaching out to the rest of the world. Africa needs to do it. The second component of that engagement is therefore the question, what is the content? What is the substance of these partnerships? I think we talk a lot about multilateralism. We talk about Africa's ability now to work within this larger framework of multilateral institutions. Africa now has the opportunity to do what? To diversify its external relationships. So the question we're asking, what is essentially the consequence of diversification? Does diversification of partnerships, in fact, contribute to strengthening African voices in the international system? An international system that remains essentially hierarchical, that remains asymmetrical. What do the partnerships do? Particularly, as we'll see in a moment, when you have so many partnerships coming on board. So the question we are raising, very skeptical question, is what does the multiplication of partnerships do to African agency? And these are issues we've been talking about since yesterday, since Brian's excellent presentation. So the partnerships are well known, from the long-standing ones such as Africa-EU relationships, into the FOCAC relationship, into TICAD. Those are the old and probably the long-lasting, if we could put it that way. But more recently, we have new versions of these partnerships. We have Africa-Turkey relations, partnership, Africa-Israel, Africa-Saudi Arabia, and we could go on and on and on. The question, therefore, we are raising, these look too many. Can we actually manage them? How is the AU trying to manage the multiplications of these partnerships? On that basis, therefore, I just want to share with you broadly the big questions we are asking in the research, instead of going into the details, because we can get to that at some point. So given the multiplicity of these partnerships, given the expectations around these partnerships, The first question we're asking is, are these partnerships effective vehicles for managing, for Africa's ability to manage the asymmetrical international system? As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, that asymmetry has been with us from the post-colonial period. So the question then is, are these partnerships enhancing or retarding our ability, in fact, to be effective actors in that international systems? Secondly, do these partnerships galvanize African voices? Do they galvanize African agency? And this is important as part of the debate from yesterday. How do we define agency? But I think the point we are asking, are these vehicles for promoting a self-confident, a dignified, and a competent African voice in international relations? And I think you can just see from where I'm going that we come at this topic through significant skepticism. And we can go into those debates maybe if we have some time during the discussion. Finally, does Africa's perennial participation in these partnerships dissipate the energies and the resources that we need, in fact, to build partnerships within the continent, partnerships within our countries? Because that's still a question that we have to ask. If we go too much into these global partnerships, how much time are we going to build ourselves? And this is a question I think that Brian was asking yesterday about the issues of collective agency. How do we actually build collective agency if we are just too much focused in summits? Every other month or every other year you're supposed to fly out and go and participate in some summit that you've been invited to. And I was reading the president of Botswana just 2 days ago saying, I don't travel with a delegation, only travel with an aide, because there's no point people following me around the world. But we see this in the FOCAC summits, we see these in these multiple partnerships, Africa congregating around the world and giving itself, therefore, the illusion of efficacy when it comes to dealing with the international actors. What I want to say, therefore, and I'm coming to the end, the three of us working on this paper are essentially Pan-Africanists. And therefore, you can already see where our criticism is coming. Because we are arguing that effective Pan-Africanism would require that, in fact, we limit, we use the word in the paper, we need a moratorium on these partnerships. And this is a debate we need to have in forums like this, and hopefully maybe our leaders are listening. So our arguments, therefore, say clearly that we are very skeptical. We doubt there is much that is coming out. And what we do at the end of the paper, we have a comparative framework for looking at African attendance at this summit. What did they get from them? Why? How did they get there in the first place? Because some of them don't even pay when they go to these summits. So they are waiting for somebody to pay. So a comparative framework, therefore, gives us a very simple cost-benefit analysis of what these summits or what these partnerships are doing or not doing. Let me stop here.
Yeah. Straight away. So that way we don't waste time. This graveyard shift is it's a challenging one. No, thank you very much, Prof, for that. So just to take off from where Prof left off so eloquently, I think it will be important for the sake of the conversation for us to understand that in terms of numbers, the African Union has over 24 partnerships that it's engaged in, and they can be categorized as such. There's a continent to country, right? So partnerships that we have with China, partnerships that we have with the US, Turkey, etc. Prof has talked about them. And then we have partnerships on institutional levels that we have with the UN, WHO, Global Fund. I don't know exactly where to place the G20, but that's the new one that's been added on. Then we have also the continental partnerships, Africa-Europe, Africa-Asia, Africa-South America. And so, as Prof had said, and then obviously we also have the institutionalized partnerships with the Organization of American States, OAS. We've got partnerships with the Organization of the Islamic Conference. We've got partnerships with the Commonwealth. We've got partnerships with La Francophonie. And then we have our own internal facing partnerships, which is the African Union's partnerships with the regional economic communities, whether it's EAC, SADC, ECOWAS, ECAS, etc. And these are, as Prof had said, problematic in managing. I don't know about you, but I mean, just the AU, just the current challenges and the polycrises that we face on the African continent, let alone managing, over 24+ different partnerships, which requires process, it requires administration, it requires a commission in some cases, interfacing at the highest possible level. We're not sure how realistic this is moving forward. And then also, in terms of that, I wanted to talk about some of the external challenges that these partnerships face. The power imbalances are quite obvious because, again, the many partnerships, such as the European Union, face a significant, and we talked about it yesterday, a significant power asymmetry, disadvantaging African countries. Recent disagreements, for example, for the AU-EU summit, which is currently ongoing in Luanda, Angola, has basically focused around issues over climate, immigration, mobility, and even peace and security, with the European Africa Peace Architecture focusing on funding for conflict prevention and management and resolution. And you'll see that even with that, the balance or the power balance that we see there with the EPF is that the EPF's budget is about $5 billion for 2021 to 2027, which can be dispersed not only in Africa, but beyond Africa. And in most cases, the drivers of that particular agenda and how those disbursements happen is largely going to be rested with our European partners and not necessarily on the African side. Secondly, if we look at what has happened in the arrangements that we've had with US-Africa through AGOA, at the end of the day, we are told that we basically survive on enjoying that partnership package that we have on the good graces of the US government, in this case, Mr. Donald Trump. So we also see that there's been a lack of a proactive strategy. And what I mean by that is that without its own overarching strategy, Africa often reacts to partners' agendas rather than setting their own agenda and priorities, which means that it leads you to a disadvantageous role. As we speak, the proposed partnership strategy is still not fully formed, and it remains contentious. But nevertheless, as other speakers have spoken about today and even yesterday, that everyone has a plan for Africa except for Africa. The third point that I wanted to talk about was the fact that there is, without a doubt, especially now more than ever, with the polycrises that the continent faces, the geopolitical interference. External conflicts and internationalization of conflicts within Africa complicate external partnerships and regional security. And we have seen this. We've seen it in Libya many years ago. We've recently seen it in Sudan and Eastern DRC. And not to forget the classical case of the COVID-19 and the vaccine justice saga. That wasn't partnership. In fact, it was a lack of partnership and complete deceit in full public view. So at every turn we are told, in word and in deed, that we are on our own. And this is not a genuine partnership. Then we have the internal challenges. Weak governance and coordination. The African Union and other organs struggle on implementation. Implementation, we have ideas. As far back as just this year, February 2025, the African Union has adopted at least 69 treaties, protocols, and conventions, including those inherited from its predecessor, the OAU. The most fundamental of these are still being violated with impunity and regularity. The African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance, we've seen the number of coups d'etats that have happened with great impunity. We've seen that the subsidiarity principle that we've seen within the regional economic communities and the AUPSC has largely condoned these illegal acts. And as a result, not much responsibility has been taken, or where we have sanctions that are being applied, it's been inconsistent. We've also seen that the principles of the African Charter on Human Rights always being violated. I mean, the violation of rights of citizens, particularly, we've just seen what has happened with the elections in Tanzania. It's ongoing and it's constant. And obviously then the issues about demanding for public accountability through the African Commission, the African Union's combating and preventing corruption on the African continent is paid very little heed. Coordination is also another problem internally. With the 9 principal organs that we have and a plethora of institutions, and some of them, let me ask a quick question. Does anybody know of a Pan-African institution called PAPU? P-A-P-U. P-A-P-U. Prof? P-A-P-U. No, it's the Pan-African Postal Union. I'm not sure even if we still have a post. And if you don't believe me, you go to Arusha, that's where they're based. I've been there, I've gone to take a look at them, and they were shocked to realize that someone still knew that they existed. Then we also have institutions that are actually quite effective, which is the African Commission for Human and People's Rights and the African Peer Review Mechanism, which because of their effectiveness is being undermined by leaders themselves. And we can discuss that at another time. Then finally, the conflict management has become a problem. Because if we don't speak with the same voice in terms of resolving our own conflicts on the continent, what then do we do in engaging these external partners when we actually sit with them, particularly within the thematic focus areas of peace and security? So as a result, you will see that the internal rivalries, imbalances or strengthened efficacies of regional economic communities. ECOWAS was thought to be one of the strongest RECs in terms of freedom of movement, in terms of applicable norms and regional values. And all of a sudden, it now houses the largest coup belt in the region, right? And to a point where at its 50th anniversary, it's on the verge of unraveling with the AES states. So these are the unpredictabilities that we have seen. Finally, just in a few minutes. So what's to be done? A couple of things. I think that the AU has to be intentional and ambitious, yet clever in how it structures its partnerships. And Prof talked about this a little bit. And I think these has to align with the long-term vision and the mission of the African Union, starting with Agenda 2063, to focus on that agenda and devise a strategy that can fund such a vision and endeavor to self-fund what's prioritized. We should not be entering into partnerships with the sole purpose that the other partner will pay. 58% of African Union's total budget for this year is funded by external donors. The European Union, the United States, and China are amongst the largest external donors. Program budget for 2025 was 77.5% funded by external partners. Maybe that's why we agree to so many suitors, but I think there's another word for that, and since we're in polite company, I will not use that word. Secondly, focus on key partnerships, and those partners that have a comparative advantage for Africa's needs and our interests. Certainly, the continent-to-continent imperative, I think, is important. That can't be avoided. But we need to tighten that relationship first, and secondly, the Global South imperatives. China is the 4th largest economy in the world. India is the 4th largest economy in the world. China is the 2nd largest, and we are told that in the next 2 decades, it will actually be the largest. So therein, as far as I'm concerned, that is a magnet for strategic engagement. Secondly, we need to anchor our engagement around the African common positions. We have very, very good CAPs. So for example, I'll just name a few in the interest of time. The post-2015 development agenda, which was a position adopted in 2014, emphasizing priorities on structural transformation, inclusive growth, climate change, etc. We talked about this yesterday and partly today. the UN Security Council reforms, the Esselwini Consensus, which is basically looking at giving Africa, 2 permanent seats at the UN Security Council. Issues around climate change, we have a common position on that. We've got a common position on migration. We've got a common position on mining, the African Mining Vision, adopted in 2009, and also the Africa Green Mineral Strategy. There's a common position around transparency and accountability, which is the common African position on asset recovery, which is a policy adopted to basically look at the 4 main pillars on detection, identification of assets, recovery, return of assets, etc. And also we've got the Africa Free Trade Agreement, as well as the freedom of the protocol of free movement of peoples. Now, the reason why I'm saying that we need to focus on the caps is because that is something that is a minimal set of agreements that all nations actually say that it makes sense to them. And it's largely also, so to say, non-controversial in many instances, because it focuses on the people-to-people factor, it focuses on greater prosperity, it focuses on trade, it focuses on long-term beneficiation of the African peoples as we move forward on that. The other element that we need to focus on is to ensure that institutions that are tasked with operationalizing these common African positions are empowered. And then the final thing I wanted to say is, in terms of empowerment, what does it mean? For me, I think there's a simple way of doing this. The Pan-African Parliament has got consultative powers, but doesn't have legislative powers. The Malabo Protocol actually, if it comes into force, will give limited legislative powers to the Pan-African Parliament. So why don't we look at starting from legislating around the common African positions and basically start setting up the mechanisms for all 55 states to start implementing them at the same time, at the same period, so that we'll be able to leapfrog and move it forward. I think that's a doable thing to do. The second thing I think certainly for us to do is, again, let's implement the Kagame reforms. Paul Kagame was so frustrated about these reforms that he ran away after almost a decade of overseeing them and handed it over to William Ruto. And I don't know what he's going to do. But anyway, it is where we are. So the reality is that we've invested money around these reforms. Some of it speaks to these partnerships, and I think there's an opportunity for us to latch onto them to move forward. And then finally, we need to prioritize the Africa policy-focused platforms. For the longest time, to a limited degree now, but for the longest time, knowledge generation that influences policy shifts have largely come from outside Africa about Africa. That needs to change. We've got the capacity, we've got the capability, we need to generate our own knowledge in terms of a systematic way. I'm not saying we're not generating knowledge, you are, that's what you do. That's what you do every day, you've been doing it for decades, but we need to create a platform where all of these things come together through an interdisciplinary measure. Whether it's economics, whether it's climate change, whether it's agriculture, food security, the blue and the green economy, the artists that we have talked about, whatever. To anything that focuses around that common African position needs to be, supported, and also needs that evidence-based approach in order to look at what the best possible policy options are for African citizens and for Africans' interests. And I think this is the approach that we need to take if we're going to look at reformulating and rethinking our partnerships with externals especially. Thank you.
As Sanusha comes up, I'm going to abuse my chair and give you one talking point. I know you have many. Are we distracted as the African Union, especially given, what has just been presented about multiple partnerships, comparing that to some of the urgent issues that we have on the continent, such as the conflict in Sudan, the ongoing issues in the DRC? Are we distracted?
Good afternoon, and thank you for staying as well. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to Prof and to Jagan. I haven't seen the paper, but from what I hear, it sounds really powerful, and I'm really waiting to read it. If I may start with your point, I think there's merit to the point of distraction, because distraction also allows you to become almost kind of allowing others to determine your strategy in these partnerships. And I think your point about Sudan, or your point about the DRC, or your point about other issues of conflict, is that these partnerships are not just about the AU. These partnerships are bypassing the AU. Because if you think about the actors that are now involved, and I love the categorization that both Prof and Jegan had placed in the paper in terms of a historical timeline from the African Union with the EU, and then kind of, articulating that you had the other actors, which are now we used to call emerging actors, which is China. Now we actually may be calling them traditional actors in Africa. And we're now moving to actors like Qatar, like the UAE, like Saudi, Turkey. You mentioned Israel, but I think Israel has a bit of a historical relationship at times with Africa, which we won't go to. But I think it's important because what it's doing is that it's almost as if, and it's not the AU per se, but I think it's the way these actors have inserted themselves in the African architecture and the landscape, is that they are now becoming key actors in conflict resolution, in peace and security, but not just from a financial perspective. They are negotiating these peace agreements with actors. So for example, Qatar and the M23 rebels, negotiating a peace agreement with the M23 rebels. At the same time, circling back to what Depro said in his address yesterday about how this dovetails with economic interests in mining, in critical minerals, and so forth. And I know I deviated from my notes that I made here, but I think it's important to contextualize how actors are now becoming hierarchical in the African context, both from a social, from an economic, but also from a peace and security perspective. But also in terms of how they may be feeding into narratives around media as well. So one of the things I found interesting, and I think I don't want to go too much into the partnerships, but you have two of the actors in a critical conflict in the Horn of Africa and around the Nile River who are in the BRICS. And both these actors are actually now also playing the politics of African Union reform with each other against who gets to be part of the Isolweni consensus with regard to nobody agreed to South Africa being or India being or Brazil being the preferred candidate of a reformed UN Security Council. The two actors I'm talking about is Egypt and Ethiopia. This year in Brazil, at the foreign ministers meeting of the BRICS, they objected to the foreign ministers' communique because they said that we have no consensus in the BRICS, despite the fact that the BRICS projects consensus. We have no consensus in the BRICS that we have agreed to the Eswatini consensus. Because we don't believe that, or rather we believe in the Eswatini consensus, we haven't had consensus on who the two countries will be. So it's an interesting dynamic that how these partnerships may be becoming externalized in other fora at the global level. So this agency that Prof spoke about the utility, the value proposition, and so forth, is that they may be playing out their politics outside of the continent as well within these partnerships that are being formed and developed in terms of the structure. The other thing that caught my attention, and I'm glad Jegan brought it towards the end, was I never heard about the Pan-African Parliament. And it's a crucial institution in terms of how you want to create the linkages with regional parliaments. But of course, it's also about what is the purpose of this Pan-African Parliament in terms of how it's positioning this African agency, this value proposition. And it will be useful to see whether they'll find traction on the common African framework, or the Common African Partnership. Because from what I saw at the P20 was that they were also sidelining the PAP in some way. It was much more about national parliaments. It was much more about what is the national interest in these engagements? And I think that plays out as well. The third point I want to make is really this question that became quite relevant around, I know we had a conversation about China earlier, but China has now moved to another continent, and that's South America. So under the China-Latin America Forum, which is actually at the starting blocks, China is using FOCAC as a vehicle to define this relationship with Latin America. So where we are in Africa with the critical minerals and China's relationship with countries in terms of the access to the extractives, they're doing the same thing in Latin America. But they're looking at Africa, at how FOCAC was defined, and they're applying it there. And China has also used FOCAC as a measurement to say how they would basically define their relationship with Africa based on their EU-China relationship. So there's an interesting pattern that's developing, and where Africa could become this kind of incubator of relationships in terms of external partnerships. Two final points, perhaps, to make, Chair. And the 2 points I want to make is really along the lines of this question of, we keep hearing that Africa is rich, but we also have the juxtaposition that is dependent on external funding. And that's a vexing question for me. What is happening to the money? Are countries paying their dues to partnerships, both the question around the internal partnerships? And if I can give you an example, two of those partnerships, internal partnerships, are housed here in South Africa. ODA-NEPAD and the APRM, as well as the Pan-African Parliament. But from my memory, and I stand corrected on this, it's only 5 countries are paying that kind of membership to hold these institutions together. Why? What's happening to the DRC money from extractives? Where is it going? What is it doing? We can always externalize our problem, but we also got to think about the internal dynamics of governance in this space. And I think Jagan had mapped it out really importantly. The last point I want to make is we now have intermediate actors that are transactionalizing some of the relationships. And I'm going to go where some people may not want me to go, and that is on how the US Trump presidency is being transactionalized by some of these partnerships that Africa is developing with actors like Qatar, the UAE, Turkey, as well as the Saudis as well. If you just think about how that played out in the G20, on the sidelines of the G20, there were more bilateral relationships being developed. There were more economic engagements being shaped. And so the question was, where was the African strategy to take all of these relationships and define it within your infrastructure development financing, within your institutional strategy, etc.? We saw the UAE come up with a major AI digital program for Africa. Question is, once you basically don't have ownership of your finances, you become vulnerable. And I think these are questions we need to ask, is that these partnerships that we need to ask about its value proposition and its utility and what is it doing for African agency is also now becoming part of the architecture of the African context. And so we heard this in the context of West Africa, that you've got Turkey, you've got Iran, you've got these different actors, but you also then have France trying to reclaim the space as well. And so I think these are challenges. If you pan across to the East African, the Horn of Africa, if you read the Thabo Mbeki report on the Red Sea, you're going to find that the actors there are even more complicated because it divides Sudan. And who is dividing Sudan? External actors who are supporting RSF on the one hand, and then of course Khartoum on the other, and it's regionalizing conflict in terms of what's now going on between Ethiopia and Somalia, access to the sea. So I think these partnerships are much more than whether it's giving us agency, it's also creating the institutional architecture that could become much more difficult to navigate because of vulnerability. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes for Q&A and discussion. Does anyone have any? Okay. So we'll start there. That's the first hand I saw. Then Dr. Weston, then this lady in the green. Yes.
So, Prof, I think, should I stand up? Or you can hear me? Okay, so, Prof, I think you should, instead of just doing a paper, do a book, but please dedicate it to Robert Mugabe, and I will tell you why. Because it was actually, I think it's like maybe 10 years, 15 years ago, Mugabe said we all are rushing to Istanbul, or we are rushing to Madrid. Why don't we just send one person? Okay, so dedicate the book to Robert Mugabe for a start. Now, so let me just comment on three things. One of the first thing I'm going to say is that when I listen to this, it's a perpetual reading of any book on Africa, actually. You know, the complaints are the same, the problems are the same. The moratorium, yeah, Mugabe warned you, so you can honor the book in his name. My take is that we need to organize and not agonize. And I had the privilege of sitting to a very old wise lady who happened to be the deputy president here in South Africa, Pumuzile. It was her word, not mine, don't quote me, this is hers. Organize, not agonize. Now, I'm all for MAGA, making Africa great again. Oh. It's great, but there are, clearly I'm not sure whether we are skeptical about multilateralism. I'm not sure whether we think multilateralism does not work. But I also know that I work for an agency that we spend months and sleepless nights trying to mobilize resources for financing development. Yeah? I work for the African Development Bank. And I think, and there are a lot of agencies like us, including national ones. Huh? And some of the problems are on issues of implementation. We have a lot of plans, beautiful plans, Agenda 2063, the reform of the AU. I don't know what happened to the Koberoka formula. If the AU still gets 58% of its funding externally. You might not have heard of the scandal where somebody was saying data was actually being sucked out of the AU headquarters, somehow secretly in the middle of the night, but going to whatever. I'm not going to name countries because it might, but you can suspect. But the people who installed the infrastructure were the ones who are listening into the conversation of what was happening at AU headquarters. Now, that is a point where we can't agonize. We have to organize. For sure, we have the money. I mean, we can put the resources if we got the correct politics in place, because people tell you that Inga can supply energy to Europe beyond Africa. Why has it not been done then? If that's the logical thing to do, are we just illogical? So, Prof, I please dedicate the book to Mugabe, but also just give us more sense. The common positions are great, but I just want to understand why we allow, and your discussion is spot on, why we are allowing these features to feature, and people are using those mechanisms to actually continue to split the ambitious unity agenda, so to speak. So it would be sad to hear my children listening to this kind of thing, and they would say, but Dad, you were there, why didn't you speak up? Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Weston, behind you, I see the hand at the back.
Thanks, Ed Toko. Great presentations. Professor, I do agree that there's need for a moratorium on summitry in Africa. because any keen observer will be hard put to tell the significance of these numerous summits and partnerships. But who will do it? For the simple reason that most African leaders, post-colonial, and it didn't begin yesterday, they've always drawn their legitimacy from without. Former colonial masters or the US. Anything they come up with, any programs, can't fly unless they've got that imprint. And therefore, sometimes you wonder, these huge delegations that usually leave Africa for New York or any of these capital cities, what do? Some ministers just loitering along the streets of New York. You wonder, what are these people doing? Basically for rent extraction. And therefore they're reduced to junkets and jamborees. Which makes me arrive at this conclusion, that part of the antipathy towards Donald Trump is that he's not afforded them this opportunity. African leaders and their spouses to go to DC for photo ops. His absence from the recent G20 summit was really prominent because it didn't bring the might of the US to this function. How are we going to address that enduring challenge, which is epistemological, is psychological, and pretty much historical? Jagan, I hear again and again about human rights violations in Tanzania, and I do agree. Democracy should not witness the kind of macabre incidents that took place in Tanzania. And then ask, are we also falling prey to narratives engineered from without Africa? Because around the same time, some nonagenarian in Cameroon, Paul Biya, dubiously won an 8th term in office without even campaigning, didn't campaign anyway. Curiously enough, the US Embassy in Yaoundé congratulated him and that they are willing to work with him. Further up in West Africa, Alassane Ouattara in Ivory Coast also dubiously got a 4th term or something after locking out his opponents. Not much noise. Not much noise. So what is it? What is this focus on Tanzania? Much as the Tanzanian leadership under Samia Suluhu stand indicted for gross human rights violations. Are we buying into some narratives that are advancing a particular agenda because Ivory Coast and Cameroon are effectively French satellite states on the continent? Tanzanian political elite are difficult to capture ideologically? Thank you.
Dr. Weston, thank you. So the last two will be this lady here, and then there was that hand at the back that I recognized. I am so sorry. You'll have to catch the panelists at tea. Sorry, I'm obligating them to now have tea.
Thank you very much. I must admit this was a very interesting conversation. We're actually having real conversations right now, talking about the African Union versus partnerships and collaborations. And mine is not even a question. I'm just in agreement with, and I actually look forward to reading the entire book, because I hope it's going to be a book at the end of the day. Yes, so yes, I'm agreeing with the fact that there's a stronger bond between the AU development partners, as they call them, as compared to the bond between the AU and the RECs. It is a serious disconnect, and I experienced it because I would go to the department to get contacts for somebody from the RECs, and nobody even has the contact for the Secretary General for the EAC or ECOWAS or any other RECs. So that just, and then you go there and ask for an email for somebody within the EU, you're more likely to get that contact within the African Union. When it comes to the establishment of institutions, I was just amused when he mentioned about the PAPU, because I'm reminded of a situation whereby the AU was willing to establish an institution, the African Center for Fertilizer Development, which was established already in 1981, and it is hosted in Zimbabwe. But then the AU was reacting to the need for fertilizer after the Ukraine and the Russia war. So there was a crisis, and I thought, oh, there's a crisis, we need to establish an institution. And that is how most institutions within the AU are established, in a very reactive way, not proactive at all, sometimes not really well thought out, and that is why we have institutions that have not been ratified by member states. We have institutions that are not funded by the AU, and the reason being that the AU, quote unquote, does not, of course, that is true, that the member states are not remitting. And the reason why most member states are not remitting to the AU is because most likely they don't see the value in remitting money to the African Union, because they don't see exactly what the African Union is. I mean, they don't see much of a change. Case in point, G20 just did. I could be wrong, sorry, let me just say, I could be wrong. But then is there any panel or any activity that was led? I'm not talking about partnerships, I'm not talking about, it was always partnership. Is there any activity that was led by the African Union that this is the discussion that the African Union is bringing to the G20? If there was one, please, I beg to be corrected. So sometimes I ask myself, who is Africa? And is Africa in the room when Africa is being discussed? And then secondly, can we just, next book please, Professor and Doctor, can we at least discuss how we can operationalize the African Union? Because I feel it's not operational. Thank you.
Thank you. So as we take the mic up to the last comment.
Madam Moderator, I do beg your pardon. We have an obstruction between the two of us. I've been waving my hand, but I don't think you see me.
Oh,
If I could please just pose a quick question to Mr. Jegan Gray Johnson. You mentioned that we need to support anything that speaks to a common African vision. What is the African vision, and is it common?
Sorry, I don't see you behind the light. So as the mic makes its way up, can I ask our panelists to get ready with your responses? As soon as we have the last question, I'll go in order of how we're sitting. Thank you.
Greetings, my name is Nosi Ponzizi. I'm a postgraduate student. I have a master's degree. I want to first thank you for including the young minds in this conference. And I saw something from the UN which says from classroom to society. So I would like to ask, how do we balance, how do we go about balancing education with what we are aspiring to implement in the society? I'm saying this because we ought to balance what is in the society with the global positioning, so that we can be able to accomplish some of the things in a realistic way that actually reflect the realities of the people. I want to ask two questions from the speakers, from the first speaker and the second speaker. One speaker mentioned interdisciplinary positioning, and also the other speaker mentioned media. So I want to ask, how do we envision artists in this whole conversation that we have? How can we use their influence to reposition our values? Thank you so much.
Oh, you want to? Yeah, wow. So let me start with my brother talked about Tanzania and Cote d'Ivoire. So I agree with you. And this is also, I didn't elaborate, but I think I touched upon it a little bit. This also contributes to the complicated nature of how we engage with each other as African states, how African states engage with the regional economic communities, and how the regional economic communities engage with the African Union, and how the African Union engage with the externals. And I say this because, and again, I don't want to just look at Tanzania, but we're using Tanzania as an example. If you recalled the Israeli observer status debacle at the African Union several years ago, I mean, that laid bare the inconsistencies of the rhetoric at the continental level and the action that's being taken place at the bilateral level. Even countries that you would have thought, if you see them in Addis, the way that they're extremely vocal against Israel's actions against the Palestinian, the issue of the two-state solution, etc., and you go back and you peel the onion a little bit back home in their political capitals, it's a completely different ballgame. They've got bilateral agreements from military to economic to agriculture, you name it. So there's that inconsistency which was laid bare. Now, and the reason why I bring that to the fore is the fact that this is a problem. The problem of inconsistency is something that's going to obviously be a major challenge, especially if you're dealing with 55 different countries, different historical backgrounds, different economic levels, different states of democracy and governance. It becomes problematic. But I am not saying that is an excuse. I'm saying that that is the reality. That, however, is compounded by the fact that in the midst of the poly-crisis that Africa faces, it's actually excavated by a leadership crisis. There's a leadership deficit, unfortunately, at this time, in this period, in our lifetime, whereby if I were to ask anybody here today to put their hand up and name me 3 or maybe 4 African states that they feel comfortable handing over Africa's future to, it'll be problematic. And the reason why I'm saying it'll be problematic is because the statistics shows that 15 to 20 years ago, when we had Bouteflika and Thabo Mbeki, Obasanjo, Abdoulaye Wade, and President Kufuor in Ghana, they were able to almost single-handedly, almost 5 presidents came together and they put together some of the most ambitious plans that the continent has ever seen. Transforming us from the OAU to the AU, they brought in NEPAD, they brought in the APRM, they brought in the Pan-African Parliament, the standards, and which is why I'm talking about the Common African Position. The Common African Position was vested in leadership and integrity. Today, what we find is we've got a leadership that doesn't have pride. We have a leadership that is not Pan-African, even though it's African. We have a leadership that colludes with our detractors to undermine Africa's agency and voice. We also have a leadership that's not even fit to be a leader. So that's the problem that we have. And I think, for me, the final point is that because of that, it is no coincidence that we're beginning to now see a rise in something we call the Gen Z, who are not quote-unquote civil society like that I represent, OSF. We don't even matter anymore. These people have decided to basically take the reins of power and do what they can and what they will with it, using the triangulation of technology, of the diaspora, and the fact that they are digital natives fighting with something that we have tried to grapple with and have not been able to come to grips with it. But because of these new changing technologies, the fact that they can organize quicker, they can organize around certain thematic focus areas, they can basically leverage the resources that they have. That gives me hope in the way that we actually now fight this massive leadership crisis deficit that we now face. Thank you.
Thank you again for those excellent questions. We came here with a proposal for a paper that we are working on, and we are leaving here with 2 books. Now, if my colleagues are willing to do it, I'm ready because I'm retired. So, yeah. I think, George, you are correct on the issue around the crisis of African institutions is essentially the crisis of Pan-Africanism. And Gaddafi, before Mugabe, Gaddafi used to complain that what can 54 countries tell China? I mean, why are we bothering to engage the Chinese alone? Even apart, even collectively, the 54 countries don't really make sense. So I'm saying, therefore, that we need to go back to the drawing board about what should continental institutions look like. And it's a very dangerous debate because it's going to ask us, what are some of these borders for? Why haven't we actually thought more creatively, even within Southern Africa, for instance? The modest objective of regional integration. You can't build regional integration when you have these too many borders. And that means we're actually not serious. We have institutions that we create so that they can fail. And this is what I think we see, whether we're talking about the African Union, whether we're talking about REX. Unless we have that cohesion, that coherent voice to work together as Africans, I think the modern state system is actually failed Africa. So we need to begin to say, how do we think more creatively about that big dream that Nkrumah put to the table? And Gaddafi tried it again. And George, you are talking about Mugabe. It will have to be Mugabe and at least Gaddafi. because they had what you call a broader, not gradualist, but an Africa where we need to go in with both our feet. I like your question around Africa is rich, but Africa is also dependent on the rest of the world. My question has always been when students ask me about that, Africa is rich, I said, Africa is not rich. We have the Angolans with oil. We have the Nigerians with their oil. How have we discussed that issue of an African oil or African critical minerals? I think this is what we've been talking about here. How do we then begin even around resource nationalism to think more continentally or regionally? We haven't even started. So we can't claim, Uganda cannot claim that Africa is a rich continent. I think we have to be careful about that framing of the problem. We have too many countries with a lot of resources. They are not ready to share those resources. Yeah. Oh, okay. Okay. I think on the earth, it's illustrated by the previous panel that the earths are important, and we need, in fact, to integrate them into our normal discussions about even integration. And the AU has the Social and Economic Council. They have the big arts departments that are supposed actually to promote that soft nature of what you're calling the arts. I think I can just stop there. South Africa. I asked that question yesterday. I asked those people on your panel, what did the AU contribute to the G20? And I didn't get a very good answer. So, Sanusha, I think maybe you can take a stab at that question.
Thank you, Prof. I'll be brief. A quick response to that is, in the T20, we had a T20 Africa. We invited institutions. In terms of the other engagement groups, I'm not sure, I cannot say with any certainty, but what we did see at the Social Summit is a lot of sideline events being hosted. So with the T20 Africa, we hosted, that was hosted with Order NEPAD. And they brought in the issues. But again, I get what you're saying. It was what was a specific AU panel that was was pushed forward, and I didn't see it. I have to be honest. I don't know, maybe Ashraf did, but I didn't see. I saw a lot of the institutions having side events, like ECOSOC and Order NEPAD, and like that. But I didn't see an AU-centric panel. So I think we missed something there. Just two little points about something that was said about, these institutions that are hosted and so forth. We found in a study that we did assessing South Africa hosting international events and chairing international organizations, a study that was done for the National Planning Commission, the International Relations Partnership Division, and we found that the UAE was very active going up against Germany to get the UN Agency on Renewable Energy. And the reason they went for it is because it was strategically linked to not their renewable energy or their COP28 or 29 or whatever it's called now, but it was linked to them understanding what were the positions in the UN, because a lot of foot traffic was coming through that institution. I'm wondering why we don't have that same kind of institutional space to be able to understand if you have the Pan-African Postal Union, or you got all of these things like the Grain Institute that you mentioned in terms of, what are you doing with it besides responding or reacting? Are you using it to understand how to develop strategy, how to actually institutionalize, coordinate, manage your partnerships at the internal level and the external level? And then the last point is, we haven't even talked about the North African context in this whole discussion, because that is another institutional space that I think requires a third book, Prof.
Thank you to our panelists. It's always great to be at conferences because you write a paper and then people tell you to write 3 books. So if there are any sponsors of the African Center who would like these 3 books, please can you approach the authors? And I think a key takeaway is that if we won't fix it, Gen Zs, Gen Alpha, and the rest coming after us will not only hold us accountable, but they'll force their way through, right? So let's get cracking. Thank you, and sorry for running over time.
It's okay. Another round of applause. Thank you so much. All right, thank you so much for that. I know that the majority of us here trade in words. We either write, read, or speak. So I have had to step in, otherwise the words won't run out. Because you're all academics and think tank leaders and read books and write books. So I'm sorry to disturb that. Colleagues, we've come to the end of a great day. I must say it's been really, really, really great. I've learned a lot over the last 2 days.